that we have until 10:15. That means that if everybody takes about 15 minutes, we should have time for a couple of follow-up questions. I'd rather have questions at the time of the presentations rather than making people wait till then. So get your questions ready. For the panelists, I will tell you that my colleague Jeff Macher, Jeff, raise your hand, is over here. Jeff will have a yellow card and a red card. We're in a business school and we try to be very punctual. So the yellow card will apply at 12 minutes and a red card at 15. It applies to all the speakers except me. And we have a special set of rules for my speech. With that, let's go ahead and start off with Raj.
Thank you for coming. I know it's bright and early, or bright and late for some of you. My name is Rajesh Veeraraghavan, or Raj. I'm an assistant professor here at Georgetown. And I'm going to read this talk, which I usually don't do because I didn't realize there was going to be a slide deck here. So the talk is, the essential point I want to make is in this talk is that we have artificial intelligence, we have technologies that are used in international development more and more, and you have people in two camps. One, we all worry about what AI is doing or technology is doing, or some of us actually are super excited about the promises of things like technology in solving all problems. Usually the talk I'm giving is to kind of try and see is there a middle ground, and not just to say that there's a middle ground, but to qualify how technologies can be regulated and can be dealt with by citizens who are not experts of technology. And so hence the subtitle of this talk is called Beyond Technology Determinism. And I propose a way of engaging with technology, this idea of many of us, or some of us at least, are familiar with this idea of patching. If you have an operating system, you have something like a downloads of an operating system, so you have a small patch that continuously fixes systems. And the question is, in that case, it's usually determined by companies that send you the software. But if you have a chance to actually have a say in what those patches are, and that's the overall summary. Like I said, the use of data and technology is increasingly becoming central to the discourse of international development, and particularly in countries like India. It's been argued that socioeconomic development can be best achieved by improving institutions. World Bank is behind it to basically create a rule-based system, and technology being a central role in it. And in India, for example, and many parts of the global south, you have things called e-government solutions, and platforms have been rolled out. The justification is to kind of reduce corruption, accountability, and the positive impact on the lives of poor by using these technical systems. And like it's alluded earlier, these systems have been confronted by a strong opposition by civil society organizations as well as by academics, who have argued that such big technology platforms worsen power imbalances, centralize power, and bring new inefficiencies. You can see that dynamic play in artificial intelligence in this country. So you don't have to kind of imagine e-governmental solutions. You can think of how AI debate has been played by these forces. So we have advocates of the use of technology on the one hand, and critics who are very wary of this technocratic rationality to address thorny problems of development. So the techno-utopians look to technology to leapfrog societal problems, and they fundamentally believe in digital solutions to problems. And in their view, technology is a magic that will inevitably solve problems of corruption, bring accountability to the state, and help in targeting public works programs to the poor. So you can see this dynamic recently being played out with the idea of cash transfer. So we can get out of public services and instead use some mobile phone money transfer to bank accounts. And so that's the kind of projects. And in India, for example, like I don't know how many of you are familiar with this idea called Aadhaar, which is a universal ID. How many of you are familiar with Aadhaar or UID? which is basically a form of technology which actually uniquely identifies an individual. It's like, think of it like a social security card, but it's actually been mandated for every single transaction. So the idea being that you could target programs to the poor, you can identify them, and you can do bank transactions, you can track people based on this ID card. And understandably, this has dealt with a lot of reaction against this technology utopianism, and the opposition is basically based on various strands of reasoning. Many have been disillusioned by this and asking questions about who actually is benefiting from these technologies. In this country, we are asking the question of internet and who is actually benefiting from the internet. How can we, this whole conference is about digital divide, but this presumes that you can have the digital divide can be solved by just simply providing access to various people. So I mean, a lot of people are questioning whether that is actually true, whether anything inherent inefficiencies that are built in with some of these technologies that will actually worsen the imbalances. And further, communities that are traditionally marginalized rarely have technical competencies needed to actually appropriate these technologies to use it for their own ends. So while internet and modern technologies afford certain freedoms, they often cannot be harnessed by the most marginalized people. So the concerns they express are important and they're justified by widespread experiences. You've seen like a lot of books in the US. For example, one book I want to call out is called Automating Inequality in the US, where this journalist academic looks at how technologies actually further worsen these existing inequalities. So the appropriate response in some cases is to resist the introduction of technology in governance. And a lot of people in the AI context have called for not using some technologies for defense or for facial recognition because they're worried about how it's going to be used, right? So in that sense, it might make sense in some cases to actually resist the introduction of technologies. In other cases, it may be useful to ask how such technologies may be developed in a way that are democratic and supportive of democratic engagement. In other cases, the support of the lobby for the use of digital technology may be strong, that the binary opposition may not yield any results. So either you're for technology or against technology might not always make sense, though it might make sense in certain cases, as I alluded earlier. For example, I would argue in the case of the Aadhaar program, which is this universal ID, a complete oppositional stand is unlikely to lead its demise. I think I would add the artificial intelligence to this category, where this complete opposition might not actually work out. In such cases, it may be politically expedient to think of reshaping the platform itself. Expedience apart, there is a strong positive case for introducing technologies and tools in governance, and well-designed technologies could indeed improve the well-being of marginalized communities. To some extent, this is not new, right? I mean, there's a whole community, technology design community, have found ways to move past this impasse by arguing for a contextual, engagement, looking at collaboration and participation. And there's another stream of research going by the word post-colonial computing paradigm, which basically questions, the colonial histories that, and in terms of how these interventions are, where is it coming from? Is it from the global north? And how do we then introduce fairness in the outcomes? And the broad line summary of what they've said is that each design approach has created tools, but we need more, we need more techniques to actually reorient them actually and get more people participating in this design process. And I would argue that it's still the power over design and expertise rests with the designers. I mean, all these paradigms essentially fundamentally leave the designer at the center. And I think I argue that we need to kind of go beyond the design solution that relies on expertise. I mean, it's kind of funny that I'm, within a coat and suit and talking about going beyond solutions that relies on expertise, because what is really at stake is the monopoly of expertise. And this one way forward is to wrest power away from the designer. Because technology, more so than institutions, are malleable, and democratic engagement is critical in order to shape technology platforms. So the argument is not to black box the technology, not to say that technology, internet is good or artificial intelligence is bad, but to actually kind of unpack it. This tactic would require focus on iteration, very simple things like raising questions of accessibility and transparency of what's there inside the software, ensuring thereby the outcomes are fair, designing simple solutions where the technology use is actually legible for all. So drawing inspiration from major democratic transformations of state practices in India, I argue for a model of exercising citizenship over governmental platforms focused on small details. At the level of, call it software patches, hence the title patching the state, well, each patch or each fix may only have a limited local significance. The cumulative impact of such continued engagement would be transformative in fundamental ways, and the tactic is more likely to lead effective and just platforms. So you can take this abstract idea and then break it down into your favorite technology that you have in mind, and you can imagine that how these thinking of these systems as a blob is not that useful, because then immediately polarizes the debate rather than to kind of look at the specifics of the details of technology and have a fight about the specific implementations of the design. I mean, that's what I'm trying to argue. So creating such democratic engagement would, shift the politics to, the mundane minutiae of technology, right? I mean, the drop-down boxes, the links, reports, and other details which are usually glossed over and usually being handed off to the designer to kind of fix. Here I'm saying the fight should be about, the discussion should be about, the deliberation should be about these small, mundane details of any technology design. So this framework thereby would challenge the centrality of designers in the act of design and call for a sustained democratic design process, which includes not just the technical design side, like I talked about, but also non-technical aspects to the center. I'm not going to give you the case. Well, maybe I have time. So, what time? How much am I? Oh, great. So a quick case in point to illustrate this argument is the fight over, I think probably many of you are not familiar with this, but I'll just very briefly talk about this program. This is called the National Rural Employment Guarantee Program in India, which guarantees work for every citizen who wants to work, and therefore there's a lot of money is getting spent on this program, and there's and calls for essentially opening up the government data for a democratic engagement. And so this is broadly under the umbrella of the open data movement. Open data allows for the ability to access these government documents, to be able to understand actions of the state. Yet these same platforms are also being worried, and activists are worried that it will be used to surveil the actions of individuals, and they're worried about privacy of this data. And so there's I wouldn't say the knee-jerk reaction, but the reaction among activists and academics have called on to shut down these websites. And so you have, again, a dilemma between, on one side, people who actually want to claim for transparency, and the other hand, people are worried about surveillance. And they're very polarized. And in some cases, as I said, sometimes shutting down these technologies might be the best response. But I think there is a way to be careful not to make that the only political response. Is there a middle ground? And I argue there is. Can we have transparency but also deal with surveillance in a way that is responsible? While some of these issues are not technological, some can be solved using technological mechanisms. But if you're so polarized in this debate, it's hard to engage. The same debate I mentioned is also in the role of technology-enabled cash transfers. There's a conflation again between the role of technology and whether it's desirable to have cash transfers in the first place. So keeping that debate separate is helpful to move beyond fixed positions. And I've actually documented some of the excitement about cash transfers and also the limits of and arguing for additional oversight by the state in the paper if you're interested. I just want to conclude with saying, I want to argue for a space where technology use does not need to come from a technocratic vision. That is usually the assumption, right? If you use technology, there's an assumption that you're trying to impose a technocratic vision. But instead, I'm arguing for a new political imagination that, that allows these technologies to be subject to democratic control. And the way you do that is by not blackboxing these technologies, but opening it up and having fights about it and discussions about it in the minutiae of the technical designs, and opening that up to agents who are broader than the designers. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj. Our second paper is going to be presented by Jorge Schement, together with John Horrigan as a co-author, and the topic is a new social contract for communications policy.
Thank you. This is a paper as part of a larger project exploring the intersection of demographic change with national assumptions and identity. If you follow communication policy over a long period of time, if you followed it as I have for the past 40 years, for example, you see that some arguments return, other arguments come and go, and that we are in a period when there are a number of concerns that are raised about communication policy, the climate in general. For example, social media is undermining democracy, consumers don't have enough choice for service, people's personal data is at risk, not enough progress made on digital equity, high-speed networks may not be fast enough in some geographic locations. Although each issue may seem discrete, we're arguing that, in fact, they're part of a larger misunderstanding and loss of language. An appreciation of an underlying bargain that exists socially between the players, government, large corporations, and the public has largely deteriorated, and that we need to rethink the bargain and reestablish the bargain in order to have a coherent language going forward under which we can compare with each other as to how well we're doing or what needs to be done. We refer to it as a grand bargain, taking that language from historical sociology. And it goes something like this. Traditionally, it has been that in exchange for the private sector building and operating networks, government and industry would regulate and create conditions to advance the bedrock principles of universality, access, and affordability. Adherence to these principles would deliver the goods that communication services enabled. It would deliver social connectedness, democratic participation, constructive civic discourse, and a sense of shared values in society. In other words, they're building blocks for nation building that are the same building blocks that were used to build the railroads, for example, the canal system, the telegraph, and other communication infrastructures of earlier times. Historically, we have relied on regulation. AT&T, for example, was granted a monopoly, and AT&T built out networks. Innovation, AT&T took its monopoly position and poured enormous amount of monies into Bell Labs, which, among other things, created a number of very important innovations and lowered the cost of at least some services. It created a competition, the language created a competition policy. Divestiture helped entrants provide competition for long-distance service, and it created a language by which we could understand why we wanted to deregulate and what the long-term consequences or goals and it opened up the possibility of using government subsidies in order to directly achieve certain social goals. If the grand bargain is actually a tension between government and industry to deliver universality, access, and affordability, the terms of the bargain have basically been the state will tolerate and at times encourage market power in the sector. In exchange, business will help deliver on social goals such as universality, even if that means some sacrifice of profit maximization. The bargain's terms required each party to live with some level of discomfort. In other words, this isn't a bargain where everybody's happy. This is a bargain where everybody's a little bit uncomfortable, but the discomfort leads to greater social goods. And that is each party Government wanted to encourage competition in the market, facilitate entry for aspiring entrepreneurs. Accommodating the reality of market power and network industries goes against that, but universality and affordability might be sufficient compensation. Industry, on the other hand, wanted to be unconstrained to maximize profits, but living with some constraints that help further social goals might sit better if they didn't completely inhibit market power. So government was saying, we want you to work on these social goals, constrain yourself into saying, we don't want to constrain ourselves, but we'll agree to the social goals and do so. That created, what's important I think to understand is it created a language. Created a language for everybody to discourse and for other players to come in and participate. And we are arguing that language has largely gone away. It's largely deteriorated. In its place, a new language is emerging, and that new language is arguing that regulation is inherently inefficient and distorts investment decisions, therefore it's bad. Network industries can only thrive with increasing scale, and scale results in market power. Equity is either a state of nature to be endured, or lack of equity is either a state of nature to be endured, or something that innovation is going to address in time. Innovation is now about data. Namely people's personal data, and business models arise from the use of that data, and they don't really receive scrutiny because of the first, which is that regulation is inherently inefficient. The past decade has seen varying responses to the fraying consensus, all of them ineffective. The Republicans, for example, on one side, conservatives have embraced almost complete deregulation with the government role in the allocation of public assets. Such as spectrum or public right-of-ways, and often giving an advantage to incumbents. Democrats have proceeded timidly, accommodating mergers, talking the language of innovation, but not really doing anything about it, setting up legal structures for light-touch regulation, and addressing equity through single-shot grant programs, but not through any kind of coherent regime. Neither knows quite what to do when innovation undermines democratic institutions and discourse. So this leaves the traditional communication policy compact and the language adrift. What can we do? Well, that's the classic policy question. What is to be done? We should go back and explore the language necessary to construct clear social goals. We should have a sense of why we want to move these forward. We should, I would argue, or we argue, we should go back and recommit to the theory of dynamic network externalities. That is, adding more people to the network not only makes the network more effective, it contributes more new ideas. And the contributing of more new ideas gives that network a greater value. We should re-explore new funding mechanisms for digital equity, investments in community anchor institutions, investments in locally created digital content, and bolstering government's enforcement capability to enforce and advocate for the compact. The elements of this new language rest on two premises. First, passing federal laws alone is not enough. It may make perfect sense to legislate a network neutrality bill that returns to the FCC authority to exercise regulation over broadband providers, but by itself, changing the legal foundation for policy, while it may be necessary, is not sufficient to develop a new compact and new language. Number two, the second premise, building capacity in communication policy has to proceed at the state and local level as well as at the federal level, and they need to be done together. That is because, notwithstanding the internet as a global communications medium, many of its current policy battles play themselves out at the local level. Most Americans have limited choices for broadband service. Frankly, the FCC's map for where broadband exists is comical, since one person with broadband access in a census tract is checked off as everybody having broadband access in a census tract. New networks require dense networks of antennas, and we're not addressing what that means in terms of all kinds of issues. Local news media withers. as newsrooms reduce staff or completely shut down their operations, and institutions that help people cope with access gaps, such as libraries and schools, are largely neglected. One brief example is the current debate over rural broadband and rural access. There's no part of it that discusses larger social goals. It's strictly transactional. Hook up people and we're done, without thinking about who's there, where they live, why they're there, and what's going to happen. Nancy and I live part of the year at Long Lake, New York, which is in the middle of the Adirondacks. It's a long lake in New York. And until fairly recently, if I wanted to have access from my cell phone, I had to walk down to the dock, stand on the picnic table on the dock, hold my phone up as high as possible, and then I might get connectivity. And if I got connectivity and stood there, I could have a long conversation with whoever I wanted to, standing on top of the table. That's no longer the case. It's a little bit better, but it makes the point they can have connectivity and not have the connectivity that we have. Now, there's an additional issue that's not discussed in the transactional language about connectivity. Long Lake is part of Hamilton County, New York. Hamilton County is the least populated county in New York State. It reached its peak population in 1918, and in 2118, if the demographic trends follow through, it will be 0. So is that an issue? I would argue rural population is an issue for a country, and it's an issue to be thought about, and telecommunications has a role to play. But telecommunications can't play a meaningful role unless you think about the larger issues of where population is going and why it's going in those directions. An emphasis on localism also brings diversity writ large into the discussion. All of this unfolds amidst a profound demographic change taking place in the country, that in many places, communities of color will grow dramatically in numbers, but they'll have far fewer tech assets for online access and special demands for content that suit their cultural or ethnic needs. I'm sure you're aware that the white population in the United States is now shrinking in total numbers, and that the non-white population is growing, and that since 2010, the percentage of non-white babies born in this country is larger than the percentage of white babies born in this country. And that's all going to play itself out in the next 25 years. Without thinking about that as part of the larger discussion, there's no way to address it. Recognizing the role of local institutions in contemporary communications policy is not unique. This paper's emphasis on building a framework for policy is in reintroducing language to the debate that has largely disappeared. If we do that successfully, we will enable diversity largely constructed of populations, culture, geography, all of that to participate in communication policy making for their benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, Jorge. If I could get my slides up, please. Wonderful. This morning, what I thought I would do is use the time that I have with you to really introduce you to a stream of research that I am doing with colleagues, my colleague here, Jeff Macher, Olga Ukhaneva, who is a fellow in the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, and Glenn Warwick at the University of Berkeley. And this is just an introduction to our research. I hope it'll be interesting to you, and you'll be able to follow up with us if you see something that's interesting. The title here is From Universal Service to Universal Connectivity. Now it's getting personal. And I'll begin in a very familiar place with you. And I'm a little humbled to follow Jorge because he's spent, as he just said, 40 years studying the issue of universal service. So I apologize for going over old ground with you. But universal service is a policy that we've embraced for over a century now of getting access to Americans to telephone service and more recently broadband at just, reasonable, and affordable rates. Now, the question is how have we historically measured that? And I don't mean to make this too simple, but this is basically it. That if you have a set of homes in the United States, I have a set of homes on the left-hand side and the right-hand side, they are wired to and connected to a telco if you're a subscriber, More recently, a cable company also could provide telephone service. But as you'll see on the left-hand side, 3 of the 4 households are connected. On the right-hand side, 3 of the 4 households are connected. So we would say that we have 75% universal service, or the penetration rate would be 75%. And that's the way we have measured universal service for decades and decades and decades. But with the advent and proliferation of cell phones, you get something like this. You get this fellow who lives, let's say, in that top left house, but he's out and about. Is he connected or not? Well, if he has a cell phone and the cell phone connection is good, he's pretty well connected. And if we have his wife now, let's say, also out of her house, connected, then we think, well, doesn't that mean that we're more intensively connected if you have both of them connected while out of the house rather than just one of them if they both have a cell phone? And here we have another woman out of her house connected. Here we have a woman at the Starbucks connected. And here we have a fellow using his cell phone at his own home, and that too might be connected. So the question here is it really appropriate to continue to think about universal service in the context of wired subscriptions to households? Wired subscriptions to households. And we're going to argue, no, that really doesn't make a lot of sense. And if you go back to observe the proliferation of cell phones, here I've tried to, just in a very simple picture, illustrate that from 1919, there's a telephone. It had a rotary dial and a receiver. The phone didn't actually change very much till the 1980s. We swapped out a rotary dial for a touch tone, and the phone looked a little different. But the only real fundamental change happened in 1983 with the introduction of cellular service. The first phone you see there on the right-hand side is what is colloquially referred to as a brick phone. It was weighed about 4 pounds. It cost $1,000, and the airtime was $1 a minute. Over time, in that little shot, you see the notion of cell phones changed dramatically. They got smaller, sleeker, faster, more adaptable. Today, we have over 400 million people subscribing to cellular service in the United States, or wireless service. There have been dramatic improvements in quality and reliability, and the functionality is, as we all know, dramatically changed. Just by way of a show of hands, how many people have a cell phone with them right now? Or let me do it differently. Who doesn't? I think it's in this room it's 0. Okay. So that has led, and these data are a little dated, but it makes the point regardless, that households have gone to, in many, many cases, to become wireless only. And the purple states are those that have the highest penetration rates of wireless only. And you see some variations across the states which are interesting that we've explored in our research. So what that means is we need to look not only at the transition from wired to wireless, but now we need to look at, and I hope you can see the slide here, the cartoon, into the proliferation of cell phones across family members. Across family members. Here's a picture of 5 people riding in a car, all of whom are connected. All of whom are connected. And that provokes the question of how connected are the American people. Here you see that we also, I just overlaid a penetration rate for smartphones, which give access to the internet, which has grown and grown and grown. So a couple of research questions that I think are important that we can tee up for us today. One is, what are the determinants of the proliferation of cell phones within households? Not whether a household has a cell phone or not, but how prolific or how much penetration there is of cell phones within a house. And secondly, can we use that proliferation to then better measure connectivity as opposed to wired service to a house, to a physical structure, but rather measuring the connectivity of individuals to electronic communications and the internet. Our first sort of substantive report on this was in the form of a journal article in the Journal of Regulatory Economics 1.5 years ago, now with the title From Universal Service to Universal Connectivity. The details are there. Let me just sort of tee it up for you, though. We draw on data from the National Centers for Health Statistics. It's sort of a curious place to get data about telephone service, but but there's an interview process that interviews about 35,000 households every year. We were able to, by application, get data to the proprietary geocoded data to find out where households are, and we know basically everything about those individual households and the characteristics of the members in them. Because we know the geographic location, we also were able to marry those data with a rich set of data from a variety of sources, the BLS, CTIA, the Federal Communications Commission, and so on. What we did is to look at two variables that we tried to explain. One is cell phones per household and cell phones per household member. And I won't belabor this. We looked at a variety of variables. Now, price and income variables, demographic variables, quality and diffusion variables, and importantly, how mobile individual members within a household are. Because if you're a very sedentary person and you're spending a lot of time at home, you don't have a big demand, it doesn't figure, for cell phone service. But if you're out and about a lot and your friends are as well, the people you want to communicate with, you might have greater demand. We modeled that. The model is in the paper. It's reported. And by and large, we get a lot of insights into the drivers of the proliferation of cell phones within households. Now, let me pivot, excuse me, to the notion of universal connectivity. Can we use that penetration data and that understanding to understand how intensely the individuals within the United States are at any given moment connected to the electronic communications network and the internet? To do that, we need to know, where are people? Where are they during the course of the day? Are they at home or are they away from home? And we need to understand what communications technology they use. And the latter question is what we addressed in that research. Now, the question is, where are individuals over the course of the day? For that, we used the American Time of Use survey. And here, over the course of, and you may not be able to see, the numbers are a little bit small, that's a grid across the horizontal axis of a 24-hour day, with midnight being on the very far left, and again, midnight on the very far right. And what you see is that most people spend their evenings at home. That's, unless you're a teenager, I guess. But typically what happens is people go away from their homes during the day when they go to work or out and about. So if you overlay those data with the communications technology that we have, the proliferation of cell phones, do people use a wireline in the household or a wireless? How many individuals use wireless within the house? We are able then to project the connectivity of Americans over time. And here's let's call it the money shot, and I've updated it for purposes of this talk, for the research from our earlier paper. And you'll see what looks like a smile here. The lowest line, the blue line here, is connectivity of the American people in 2003. And as you move forward to 2006, 2009, 12, and so on, you see that curve gets flatter and flatter and flatter. There's been tremendous increases, significant increases in the connectivity of the American people throughout the day, regardless of where they are, over the 2003 to 2017 period. I think that's really interesting. Since this is a conference on the digital divide, I thought we would cut this by income. And what you see in the blue lines down below is in 2003, with the dashed line, you'll see households that we surveyed that were surveyed with who live below poverty, and the solid blue line are households that live above the poverty level in 2003. And you see that, sure enough, consistent with the story of the digital divide, people with lower incomes do, in fact, have lower connectivity rates than people who live above the poverty level. Now, let's move forward from 2003 to the red lines, which are 2017, and you see substantial progress in the degree of connectivity among both people that live below the poverty level and those who live above the poverty level. So by 2017, and I think this is not insignificant, by 2017, at the lowest moment of connectivity for poor people, for people that live below the poverty level, they are significantly more connected than people who lived above the poverty level in 2003. So that's a lot of progress, it seems to me. All right, so let me just conclude. Let me conclude with a few just simple points, and that is that there has been a massive shift in communications methods, and that compels, I think absolutely compels, jettisoning traditional methods of universal service to move to an understanding of how connected the American people are throughout the day and regardless of where they are, because we just want to do more things in more places than ever before and at times that might not be so traditional. Secondly, that if we understand the penetration rate of cell phones throughout the household, we can move, I think, smartly to a measure of universal connectivity as opposed to universal service. That measure of universal connectivity, just as a matter of fact, has improved dramatically in the 21st century. And that while gaps in connectivity continue by income, those gaps are in fact narrowing. And as I mentioned, we have a situation where people who are living below the poverty threshold today are more connected than those who are living above poverty in 2003. So with that, let me close. Thank you very much. And let me say that our next speaker is Ben Merkel, who is from Senator Murray's office. I think all of you were in the room maybe yesterday to hear Senator Murray's video, and I'm sure this will follow up on that in a speech about the Digital Equity Act. Thanks, Ben.
Yes, again, my name is Ben Merkel. I'm Senator Murray's legislative director, and thank you again for allowing me to talk a little bit more about the senator's legislation this morning. And really, I think it is a great kind of dovetail to a lot of the topics raised today about how we're contemplating not only kind of the growing ubiquity and just in general development of connectivity and networks over the past 30 or 40 years, but also how that should inform policymaking and regulatory perspectives going forward. Specifically that, I think from a federal policy perspective, that we should be focusing more on where people actually are and how they are using this connectivity as opposed to trying to impose standards or top-down kind of ideals or assumptions about that connectivity, which might have served to build out these networks in the first place, but is not reflective of how people are using them today. So as brief ways of kind of an overview of what I want to be talking about today is to provide some context for how Senator Murray arrived at this issue of digital equity and kind of a determination to do something from that federal policymaking perch about it, and then to provide a brief overview of the bill and an update as to where we are with it. So about a year and a half ago, I had the opportunity to sit down and kind of a level setting prioritization conversation with her, and one thing that she remarked upon is that when it comes to issues of telecommunications and connectivity, that in some ways she appreciated but wanted to get away from the kind of traditional battles that we have, if you will, over telecom policy, like net neutrality, like industry regulation, or even infrastructure. Not to say that those are not important; those are extremely important and remain, issues of focus. But that what should start to undergird and shape the conversation going forward? That should we be focused on, again, kind of the same thing that we've been doing at the federal level in terms of providing for that universal service, for ensuring rural access, for trying to expand and deepen networks while maintaining some level of competition and consumer benefit? Or should we start to begin to think about what does it look like when we start to achieve that universal service or connectivity and how people will be using that? So that left to me the fun part of kind of digging into this issue and really looking to Washington State for some potential examples or ideas, and could not be more fortunate given that the state is a leader, and joined by one of those leaders today, David Keyes, who's been instrumental in a lot of these efforts out in the city of Seattle for several years now. So over the course of that process and talking with a number of stakeholder groups within the larger digital equity, digital inclusion community, specifically I have to name Angela Seifert and Laura Breeden from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, who played an instrumental role in helping us draft this bill, kind of came to a general framework and model for how a federal policy centered on digital equity and digital inclusion might come together. So the bill, simply named the Digital Equity Act, decided not to get too cute with acronyms or backronyms, is pretty straightforward in its goals and its function, which is basically that we believe that there are tremendous gains to be made by investing in the people who will use the infrastructure of connectivity, where we need to continue to, again, focus on access, focus on competition, focus on all the, essentially the pillars of policy and investment that have built our modern telecommunications networks, but those networks are not ends unto themselves, but a means in terms of providing Americans, other residents of this country, with the means to, whether it be access educational opportunities, economic opportunities, or otherwise just enrich themselves and their families. So from there, what we decided to do was, rather than try to impose a one-size-fits-all federal policy around it, is to essentially provide resources to states, local governments, and other kind of local actors within the digital equity space to really pursue the goals and objectives and plans that best fit their own needs. So the bill, from a top-line perspective, targets a number of specific populations that have historically been overlooked or underserved, not only from a telecommunications perspective, but also from a government service perspective and just a general, socio-cultural perspective. So that includes individuals and families 150% of the federal poverty level and below, racial and ethnic minorities, rural populations, people with disabilities, people who speak English less than very well, whether they are English language learners or adults with literacy challenges, veterans, a whole host of individuals that have either previously been essentially identified for additional assistance and investment from federal and state governments, to individuals or communities that simply lack connectivity or kind of the levels of connectivity that we certainly have come to expect, in a city like Washington, D.C. or in Seattle or any kind of metropolitan or urban area. From there, we decided to tightly define the issue that we were trying to solve, using accepted definitions for digital equity, for digital inclusion, and tied a lot of our metrics as far as broadband adoption and broadband itself to accepted standards, while also trying to ensure that there is some flexibility for changing technologies and also, societal change. So from there, the bill sets up 2 grant programs, each authorized at $125 million a year over 5 years, so coming to about $125 billion a year, over the course of the bill's initial authorization. The first grant program is fairly straightforward. It's a competitive grant program, and both programs are administered by the National Technology and Information Administration, in some ways kind of a spiritual successor to elements of the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program as part of the 2009 stimulus. But the competitive grant program is awarded to individual entities, whether they be schools, libraries, municipalities, could be consortiums, or public-private partnerships, to target a specific population or populations that we target in the bill with any range of interventions that we list specifically, whether that be increasing access to educational opportunity or employment opportunity, again, kind of runs down the line. Also, while providing the administrator of the NTIA with some flexibility as to adding or updating those allowable uses. There are, I think, a number of transparency and accountability requirements, but we don't want to set hard and fast objectives or goals or metrics for these applicants to meet. The idea being, we want to encourage a lot of innovation, a lot of risk-taking, and to form an evidence base that currently lacks at the federal level for digital equity and digital inclusion interventions. The second program, which is a little more complicated, but I believe to be a little bit more interesting, is a capacity building program aimed at states. And states in this case includes the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, in addition to the 50 states. So the capacity grant program requires for a state, through their governor, to designate an entity to serve as the recipient of a grant. And then for that recipient, that grant administrating agent is what the administrating entity is the term that we use, to define and submit a plan for achieving the digital equity and digital inclusion goals of that state, where they have to document how they are reaching each of the targeted populations, the different partners they're engaging to reach these populations, and some of the interventions that they will be supporting as a result of the gap that they identify. So the capacity grant program is formula derived, or awards for the grant are formula derived, and based upon 50% is based upon the state's overall population, and then 25% is based upon the comparative level of connectivity within that state as compared to other states who are applying for the grant program. And then finally, 25% is based upon the comparative population of targeted populations within that state to other states applying for the grant program. Again, to be eligible for the capacity grant, all that states have to do is submit their plan and to have an entity that has a demonstrable ability to administer the program, and they get the award. And we also, again, trying to make this as easy as possible for states to apply, so we do provide planning grants at the front end for states to access. So from there, states, they receive their grant after their plan is approved, and then I think currently 71% of the grant has to be sub-granted out or otherwise applied towards achieving the goals of the plan, while another 20% can be reserved to update and maintain the plan. Finally, there's a research element, which is where we task NTIA with essentially collecting and then making searchable in a publicly available, machine-readable online format the initial results and just descriptions and factors of the grant awards made, so that this way, one thing that we heard from the larger community is one of the small tragedies of the BTOP program winding down was that there wasn't enough effort to maintain and to preserve a lot of the insights, after actions, and reports done in tracking some of the really exciting work done around sustainable broadband adoption and public computing centers. So I want to make sure that we are not repeating that mistake, and also offer an evidentiary base for identifying new paths forward, so that if a community in one rural part of the country is able to identify an intervention that worked in a similar but otherwise not instantly or immediately connected rural part of the country, that you could have that conversation and that exchange going. Kind of one thing that, again, going back to this point of not wanting to impose a top-line requirement or certain goals in terms of thou shalt, attain or achieve a certain level of digital equity, is that we, again, want to allow for grant recipients, whether they be states for the capacity grant program or individual entities for the competitive grant program, to define what success looks like for them. The flip side of that, and ensuring that we are using public funds in a responsible fashion, is ample amounts of accountability and transparency and oversight in terms of the execution and administration of that grant. One thing that we also heard as a result of the BTOP program, which had a similar imperative, was while that's important, that reporting can't be burdensome, where I believe with BTOP it was required to be done every 90 days. We require it on an annual basis, but we also require for binding assurances to be given at the front end upon award and receipt of the grant. So the bill was introduced on April 11th, 2019, so about 6 weeks ago or so, and really the Senator is extremely proud and very happy with the rollout. Over 50 external organizations and advocates have endorsed. We have 17 co-sponsors ranging from Elizabeth Warren to Doug Jones, and we are currently working on a House companion to be introduced soon, and hope that that will be able to move as either part of a larger infrastructure package, or we're also in a conversation with a number of Republican offices to see if we can have sort of broader bipartisan support. So I think I'll reserve kind of any other questions about the path forward or our general legislative strategy for the question and answer, not wanting to get the dreaded red circle, but thank you again for allowing me for a couple minutes to talk about the legislation, and again for providing Senator Murray and her office with the opportunity to share this bill with community stakeholders like yourselves.
It does indeed look like we have a few minutes for questions. So if you would, I think the protocol is that we'd like you to speak with a microphone so that this could be recorded for posterity's sake. And a microphone will come to you. And then if you would, identify yourself, please, just for the record, and then go ahead and state your question.
Hi, I'm Nancy Cronick from Rutgers University, but more importantly, I represent the library community in this discussion. So my question sort of that goes across, but more focuses on some of you, is when we talked about universal service in the '96 bill, we put in the E-rate, which was an attempt to make sure every community in America had access. So when we count universal service, we count households. But the universal service provisions in '96 were focused on anchor institutions like libraries and schools. So in talking about possibly changing our language or what we're counting about universal service, we still leave out the count of community-based access. And the importance of that, because community-based access, first of all, just for those of you who are not aware, or weren't at the program yesterday, these institutions are very heavily used. The demand way outstrips. But one of the reasons is because of the high end, not just connectivity. You know, in Long Lake, we do have connectivity up in the Adirondacks now, thanks to having a Verizon executive in the neighborhood, but we don't have to go there. But our connectivity is not so great. Some of you have experience being out in the middle of nowhere. We have to go an hour before we can pick up a cell phone signal, so you can't navigate in the Adirondacks with a cell phone. But anyway, you can go farther than that. But each community does have a library, and the library has some connectivity, probably pretty good, and the schools have connectivity. But if we want to really count, don't we have to somehow talk about universal service in terms of community universal service and not just household or personal universal service, and how are you thinking about that? So, and thank you, Patty Murray's office. We love your bill. I think the American Library Association is already on board. Thank you. So yes, we greatly appreciate your work. So, anyway, that.
No, and thank you again. And as the Senator, huge fan of ALA and librarians in general. I think if there's been, an especially gratifying part of working on this bill is just getting to know the library community more and just developing a healthy.
1,200 coming next month.
If I've learned one thing is that librarians are to be feared not because they'll shush you, but because they will work harder than you at anything you think you can accomplish. He's made sure I'm amply aware. I think to your point, though, in terms of E-rate and these notions of universality, this was something that we were very sensitive to, and again, where the larger E-rate community has done a fantastic job of educating members on the Hill of not only how important that program is, but also that its goals remain relevant and necessary. So first and foremost, this bill is a complement to E-rate and the other USF programs. We have language there to ensure that it is supplementing and not supplanting those dollars, and also that it has this is an adoption bill, it's not a deployment bill, if you will. But, I think to those ends, too, that certainly the perspective guiding, Senator Murray, this legislation, is that when it comes to defining universal service and thinking through universal service, that we need that holistic view, and that connectivity, which is essential and important, and that should, I think is certainly to Professor Mayo's point, needs to be in line with, modern technology and applications. It also has to encompass the realities and the purpose of that connectivity and that service. So ensuring that, to your point, that yes, if library has a connection and has that connectivity, is that connectivity adequate for the demand and need of that library's population and service base? And also, does the library's constituents have the skills and equipment and support necessary to make use of that connectivity? So I think to this larger, question of what does universal service look like going forward, without, number one, to touch the very successful Universal Service Fund and program and all that, and to, not in that sense, but I think from this kind of larger academic sense, that we should be evaluating from a policy perspective, how to encompass these various requirements and needs and purposes of this connectivity, and how it flows into efforts to support it and to deploy it and to make sure it is useful to populations across the country. Did that answer your question?
So I'll let the library part stand for itself. I think you raise a couple of other questions, issues. One, the notion of the community-based measures. And what I would suggest there, I think that's a wonderful idea. If you, from our approach, you can simply aggregate, we broke it down to an individual level, but I think it's very useful to see how does this aggregate up to a community level, to a state level, to see where we're succeeding and where we're failing. One of the sort of interesting aspects of our research goes to something that Jorge mentioned a moment ago of dynamic network externalities. Is a fancy term, but the general notion of my demand for these services may very well depend on how many people in my community and how intensively are they themselves subscribed to electronic and internet services. Our research finds, I think for the first time in a wireless space, that these dynamic network externalities do in fact exist. That is to say that I am more likely, ceteris paribus, to subscribe to wireless service if my community is more subscribed, holding everything else equal. So I think there really is something to be gained from moving to the community level. Final thing, you're quite right on quality. Quality of, at least of mobile telephony is not the same everywhere. We know that. Again, those things are changing. More Verizon executives should move into more rural areas. That may be one of the policy implications, if I understood you correctly. But it's getting better, but we really do need to do a better job of measuring that.
So I have a quick question for the table regarding, John, what both of you said, which is if I travel to the barrio that's near our home, and I go into the little bodegas that are in the barrio, they are selling minutes to folks. And if I question folks about what they're doing with those minutes, that's their connectivity, is through those minutes. So finding who has a cell phone is one thing. Finding who runs out, at what time they run out, and then no longer have connectivity, tells us something else about actual ability to use at the lower end of the economic range. So I'm concerned that we don't really have a handle on that because we don't measure that at all. And those are the folks actually we want to bring in as much as we can. So what do you think about that, John?
Well, as I think most of the people in this room know, there's been a change in the portfolio of the way consumers subscribe to mobile telephony, from postpaid to prepaid. And as you just identified, if you look at the demographic of the prepaid folks, it is generally lower income folks. And that has been, in the policy realm, the real challenge, because we saw a run-up in the budget expenditures for once those wireless prepaid minutes were included in the Universal Service Fund. And there was a blowback and a pushback to that, yet those are the very, and there may very well have been some waste and corruption in that space, but the legitimate part of it is that there are people that are the most vulnerable in that population. So you'd really like to target that and improve the efficiency of the ability to reach those prepaid customers.
How do you measure how many are out there, what percentage are out there?
That's the million-dollar question. And the reason I say that is that while you might think that income is a really good measure or the best filter we have. It turns out a lot of low-income people subscribe to cell phones anyway and may subscribe intensively, and the thing they give up are the wired services. So they may be, if you just use income as a filter, you may not be targeting as efficiently as you'd like. We have other questions.
So this is kind of for Professor Mayo, but for anybody else who wants to respond. So I'm from University of Texas. We've been doing a lot of research with the city of Austin over time. And we found that there's a lot of smartphone use. It's almost ubiquitous, up into the 90s percentage. But the single thing we're happiest about is a much lower than national index of cell phone dependency. For a couple of reasons. We also find that there's a skill set that goes along with cell phone use predominantly, quite distinct from the skill set you need to go get a job at an actual business that uses computer-based equipment. And so the thing I'm a little worried about is that we don't permit anybody to pat themselves on the back in a policy way for the high level of cell phone penetration. Because I think what we're seeing as a pattern in our research is it's there, it's laudable in many ways. People who are connected who weren't connected before. But we're in some danger of reaching a low-level equilibrium with people depending on that, which doesn't let them do their homework, doesn't let them apply for a job, doesn't let them do all kinds of things. I mean, we have to be realistic about the affordances of a smartphone, what it can do and what it can't. So I think we've got a problem with all the things that require a higher level of affordance. We've also got a problem with the increasing movement of all sorts of video services onto the telecoms infrastructure. So I'm maybe the only person in the room who's researching this and Netflix at the same time, because we're kind of transforming two very large sets of infrastructure. One, for the cell phone and beyond into personal and productive connectivity, but frankly transforming the way that we do television. And a cell phone isn't particularly adequate for that either. So I'm kind of wondering how we resist the temptation to say, like George W. Bush on the aircraft carrier, mission accomplished. So how do we sort of maximize this thing, which is quite real? I like the way that your research demonstrates the progress over the years without resting on that laurel. How do we be very clear-eyed about what else needs to be done, particularly for the people, as Jorge points out, that are relying on this in a fairly minimal way?
Let me be brief because other people may want to weigh in. I think you identify something that's very important, and that is that while we can measure the increased connectivity of the American people, that measure doesn't, and we account for their ability to access the internet, it doesn't account for what precisely they are doing with that technology. And I agree with you that we shouldn't prejudge that either way. Your suggestion that they don't do homework, or can't apply for a job on cell phones, on a smartphone, may be true. I've actually seen people doing exactly that on phones like this. It's an empirical question of how constraining that is, and the technology is evolving rapidly over time. 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, many people would say no one would ever watch a movie on a telephone. And yet today, I bump into people in the hallway, our students who should be studying, watching movies all the time on their phone. So I think you should keep doing your research, get the ideas of what the technology is going to evolve to, and what consumers demand. So the constraints of job applications and homework are very important. I just don't want to prejudge it either way. Other people may have thoughts.
Just briefly, policy may not be able to address the larger social issues of ability or actual uses or the churn who goes on and off because of the minutes they buy during the month. But if that's not part of the language, then we don't achieve the goals in the long run. Because we are focusing on something so narrow that we walk away from it when it's done. And in fact, there's a much larger phenomenon out there that's taking place. So it seems to me that from our point of view as academic researchers, we have to commit to keeping that language out there. We have to write better theory, we have to write more theory, and if these guys read it, they may not be able to put it actually into their bills, but they're aware of it, and it shapes the way that they think about it. One very brief example. In 1995, Milton Mueller and I wrote an article that, or maybe he didn't, I don't remember if it was him or both of us, that I wrote an article that ended with a brief challenge that said we ought to be thinking about universal service differently. We ought to be thinking about it as an evolving concept. Well, that phrase, evolving concept, then showed up in the Telecommunications Act of 1996, and it helped change the way we think about universal service because it opened up possibilities to what we would consider a universal service in an era of changing technology. So that's, I think, where we can make our contributions and where our commitment can actually help policy, the actual policymakers who are writing the text.
No, and I think, I mean, your larger points are exactly right, that, to draw an imperfect analogy, nobody in the United States pats themselves in the back for having 98, 99% levels of literacy. That it's how those skills are being applied and used so that people can use them as a means of, not only functioning in everyday life, but, advancing themselves and meeting their kind of own goals, their own priorities, their own needs. And that's really what I think, again, to the points that I think you both make in terms of the essential role of academia here in defining not only these terms and these concepts, but also the various means that we can measure that connectivity in a way that is current. That forms the baseline for that policy making, and that it's incumbent upon us as policymakers to recognize that, again, that universal service, in some ways, I remember talking about this with the senator, that the question is, let's assume universal service. What then? And that this is an effort, this bill is part of an effort to answer that question and to think, what do we do now that we've achieved that? So again, some of the allowable uses of the grants in this bill calls out digital literacy and digital skills training to make those investments in the people using that connectivity in the first place. That kind of moving, that salubrious moving of the goalposts, if you will, to define what the goal is that we're trying to achieve through these federal policy interventions and supports, in addition to simply making sure that everybody has, whether it's a smartphone or wired connectivity, that's no longer purely the goal, but to ensure that connectivity is useful and that people have the skills and support they need to use it. So
I just want to add one comment. I think I completely echo what your assumption behind your question is, and I think a lot of research has been done I think we can learn even in the US from other countries where, for example, the fact that phone penetration is there widespread in many parts of the world does not mean that everybody has access to it, meaning even if it's reached a home, we find that the phones, for example, has been used by men. And so so it's an important kind of question. I think you're absolutely right that you can't assume that people won't access these, students won't access these, videos, educational videos or whatever on the phone. But if we expect Georgetown students, for example, maybe it's a fictitious example, but Georgetown students to actually listen to a video and then expect a response, then if people have differential access across it, so then you're actually leading to a problem in terms of expecting a certain level of quality, in terms of access to these devices. So I think if the politics of measurement, from what I don't know this area, but from what you were saying, you're counting service and in universality of it. I think we probably have to kind of learn to count different things, and I think not just to resort to academic writing papers, but actually even in policy, we probably have to come up with different measures, I would argue, rather than just kind of resting, saying, hey, we got 98% access, which might be, might have only 60% of actual use. So I think we need to kind of come up with a different measure.
I have a quick question if you have a moment.
We're about 5 minutes over.
If you can do a yes/no on it.
Very good.
There's a lot of talk about low Earth orbit satellites, Earth web, and so on, hooking up institutions. Do you see it making a difference, a big difference, and in how many years?
Yes, and I don't know.
Yes, I'm using satellite imagery to kind of classify access to public services. So it's these things are super useful.
Yes, great potential in the rural sector. I don't know.
Yes, and many of those satellites are built in Washington State by SpaceX and future, hopefully Amazon. So hope that everybody can enjoy, again, the bounties of the Evergreen State. So,
With that advertisement, let's thank all the panelists.